Hope everybody's doing well. It's time for another edition of the radio show with Mark Lee, and we've got an amazing guest that's going to share their story and what they've been through, and all along those lines. But definitely, I hope that everybody's having some success in their life and all in that kind of way. Because I'm down here in Durham, North Carolina, which is better than being in the mountains of North Carolina. Because as you know, Hurricane Helene definitely did some damage, and there are people that are still recovering from that, and all along those lines. But definitely, even in the area of Rocky Mount where mom lives and everything, there was a little bit of damage, but not nearly what was going on in the mountains and, of course, in parts of Florida and Georgia and other places. And now they're talking about another storm coming our way and all in that way. So we're going to see how this all plays out and what goes on in that kind of way. I know that my dad, who just recently suffered from well, not suffered, but had a heart surgery and did well in that heart surgery. And then he went to the rehab center. And then on yesterday, he came home. So he actually went home and is now sitting in his own house and relaxing, even though he had to get the walker and get the house refitted in order to deal with the comfort and all along those lines. But it was definitely good that he was able to have the care in the rehab center that he was at and all along those lines. But it was definitely something that is positive to know that dad is sitting at home. And like I said, his lady love during the time of all of this and when Helene was going on, it showed me Central Park, which is where our farmers market is, and it looked like a little lake and everything. So she showed me a picture, and then I think I have somewhere on my computer and all along those lines. And mom mentioned that her house had like a little lake as well, but both of those have now back to their normal ways of looking. But a lot of people are still without power in the mountain areas, and a lot of people are still dealing with rescue efforts up there as well. And speaking of rescue efforts, a lot of us could not deal with the hardships that my first guest went through and all along those lines. I'm looking forward to hearing from Rachel Zimmerman and hearing about this very emotional story that she went through and all along those lines, because a lot of us could have not dealt with it in whatsoever and all along those lines. So Rachel, is glad that you were able to be with me and all along those lines. And you've definitely been through a lot, because I mean, you've been through the whole notion of having to deal with love and suicide. And I know some people, including some of my friends, that have thought about even contemplating that and everything along those lines. So I know that it is a very difficult topic to talk about, and a lot of times people don't like to even deal with it. But I've even had some of my musician friends that I've had to kind of like, I hate to use the term, talk them off the cliff, because they have definitely talked about the idea of wanting to commit suicide and all along those lines. Definitely is one that cares for a number of people, and don't have any kids of my own, but I definitely support a lot of people, including some that are in my friend circle and all in that space. So I just wondered if you could share a little bit about your story, and of course we'll get into some of the more details as I hear more about it. But I know a lot of folks are going to be quite fascinated by what you've gone through, because one of the things that I can tell you about the network Pod TV is that it is founded by two folks, and one of the founders, Kim Calhoun, actually is very passionate about women's rights and the things that you ladies go through. She actually came up with a patent that dealt with domestic violence and all along those lines. So she actually came up with a patent that helped people be monitored that are in those situations and everything like that. And then Nick Valveda, who is a pension attorney, part of the reasons that they founded this network is they found a lot of stories were not being covered and not given the attention that they deserved. And all along those lines, a lot of groups, including minority groups, weren't getting the attention that they deserved as well. And the reason it resonated with me is because way back in the era of the independence celebrations of 1976 and everything is when my parents started a radio station for similar reasons. But instead of a live stream network, it was a radio station, and that lasted for about 11, 12 years or something along those lines, because they were frustrated that they weren't hearing the voices of the minority community. They're big jazz and blues fans, and they weren't hearing the music that they wanted to hear on the radio. So they kind of decide to create their own network and all along those lines to address that, and then have gone on to respectful careers and everything. Dad, who I mentioned earlier, is back at home, but he's a very talented artist. He's done everything from gorge to photography. And mom retired and is enjoying retirement, but she was the first president of the Golden Leaf Foundation, which is the tobacco settlement money, and all along those lines. So definitely, the notion of activism is very important in my life, and it has been important in my life all my life, and all along those lines. And I might share some more of my activism background, including some stories that Dad shared with me while we were going through getting ready for him to go home on when I visited him on Saturday, and then he went home on Sunday, which of course was yesterday and everything. But love to hear your thoughts around some of the things that you are doing as well.
Right. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. And I'm glad your dad's okay.
Rachel,
So,
for some reason, I
yeah,
don't know if it's your mic or my mic. So let's see if something's going on there because I'm not hearing you. You were hearing me though, right?
I'm totally hearing you. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes, there.
Okay. Well, I said thank you so much for having me on the show, and I'm glad your father is okay. Um, Basically, this book, Us After, a memoir of love and suicide, is about the suicide of my husband, the father of my children, Seth Teller. And let me just tell you a little about him before I delve into the story.
Please.
Seth was a devoted father. He taught robotics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was really close with his parents and his family, and he didn't have the kind of classic signs we think about when we think about somebody who considers dying by suicide. So the book is both sort of my questioning and digging as a reporter for more than 20 years about what happened because it felt like it came out of the blue, but it's also about rebuilding my life with my two young daughters who were 8 and 11 at the time he died. And really, people have asked, like, us after, who's the us after? And of course, the us after is my kids and me. It's also like when somebody dies, you still have a relationship with them. It's obviously different, but it's that us after. And also, it's everybody out there because, as everybody's got some kind of trauma or loss. It may not be the same as mine, but if you're a grown up, you've basically gone through something, right? And so we all have these stories, and the book is sort of a way of encouraging a conversation about these hard stories, whether it's
Yeah.
suicide or some other loss.
And speaking of which, I'm glad you mentioned that because a couple of things crossed my mind as you were saying that. One, and I don't think I'm speaking out of school because she brings it up herself and everything along those lines. I don't know how long you were in the relationship with your husband and all along those lines, but the first love of her life and everything along those lines, and meaning Kimberly, the founder of the network, was her husband. And her husband actually died during the pandemic. And for a long time, she was at a loss. She'll even say that she was at a loss. It took her a while to get herself together. And I think that even now, she's just now beginning to reach out into the dating world and everything. Because, like she says, and it said to me, and it said even on this network, the first person that she really had any love with and any real connection with was that husband, and that husband passed away during the pandemic. And like you, they have I think it's two kids. I think it's two sons, if I remember correctly, and everything. So, what advice would you give to people that are going through that based on your own experience? And of course, yours was a somebody that took their own life, whereas hers was a natural loss, but it's still a loss nonetheless. The way that you just said it and everything. So,
Right, right. A couple things about that. First of all, we were married 12 years, together for 15. Um, and I just would like to say one thing about suicide before I give some
yeah,
advice. But, suicide is still so misunderstood and stigmatized. And we still have a lot of shame in society about it. And, historically, suicide has been considered a crime. Some religions consider it a sin. Some people think of it as like a supremely selfish act, right? Or a choice. But what I came to see suicide as I did a lot of reporting and investigating of my own situation, is it's really related to a brain illness, a mental illness, right? And so we don't say somebody, committed cancer or is selfish because they died from a fatal cancer, right? We know that it's sort of these cells in your body, renegade cells, who for some percentage of people who have this illness, they end up, it ends up being fatal. So I like to think, I think that it's really important. What I tell my kids is, when you're in that suicidal state, it's not like you're thinking of your kids and your wife and your mother. You're thinking about the psychic pain you're in and how to end it. So I think part of it is sort of under getting to an understanding of what suicide involves, even though, of course, it's completely incomprehensible, right? Because it's against your all of our human instincts to survive. But what I would say, I mean, this book has, as I've been out in the world talking about it, people come to me and ask just that same question that you asked, like, what do you do? Like the father of your kids, and you really don't think you're going to be able to go on. The day my husband died, my oldest daughter, again, she was 11 at the time, she said to me, "Mom, are we ever going to be happy again?" And I said to her, "Yes," but I completely didn't believe it. I thought we were just doomed. I thought, like, how do kids get over this? How am I going to get over this? But it's been 10 years now, and it's also very human to put one step in front of the other and take care of what you have to do in that day. And when you have kids, you got to take care of your kids. You got to, like, keep a roof over their heads and food on their plates, right? And you got to go to work. So you sort of find this strength that you never thought you had. And what I would say to people who are experiencing either a sudden or a death from an illness is, it seems like it will never get better in the moment. You can't imagine being in a different space, but it does get better. It's human nature to not necessarily move on. I don't really like that term, because you never really move away from the person you love, but your relationship changes, right? And it's, the pain is not as acute. And you start to find sort of the good in what remains. And for us, we still talk about Seth all the time. The kids, like, have some of his old clothes and, like, have cut them up and wear them, and they're like part of their rotation. They have like little crop tops that are his former t-shirts that he used to play Ultimate in. Um, but I would say the other thing I would say to people is, I had my kids, I was a little older and I had a career established. So I sort of thought, like, I can handle motherhood on my own. And then when my husband died, I realized I need to ask for help. And I would say to people, it is not a sense of weakness to ask for help. I mean, our community saved us. I had, like, mothers of my kids' friends, like, bringing us food, driving them to all their gymnastics and birthday parties, picking up the phone in the middle of the night when I was anxious and freaking out. And you have to lean into your community and ask them to help and ask them for what you need. So I would say those are really important things to remember.
That makes a lot of sense. Just really quickly, Rachel, along those same lines and everything, or do you think it's easier sometimes to deal with suicide when it comes from different parts of the age range and everything? And the reason I'm asking this is because I remember, and I think she's passed as well, a friend of mine, and somebody that I've known a long time here in our Durham, North Carolina activism community. Her son actually committed suicide when he was a member of a Quaker school. I think he was going to Carolina Friends at the time, and if I remember correctly, that is a Quaker school and everything. And of course, I'm sure bullying and other things played a factor as to why he decided to end his life and everything. But I'm just wondering, because sometimes even now we're hearing a lot of people, you mentioned having kids, and I'm thinking your kids are older now, but a lot of the kids are concerned about different things. There's social media, and there are a lot of other things that are pushing some of our kids toward this. And like I said, this happened a number of years ago. It happened way before COVID. Mikey's death and everything was probably 15, 20 years ago, if I'm thinking about my timelines and remembering them correctly. But it definitely impacted our society here in Durham for a number of years, because I don't think people were expecting a young person to take their own life. And particularly, I think he did it on the school grounds, if I remember correctly, and everything. But I just wondered your take on even how it
The
impacts the
age.
different ages, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think suicide at any age is traumatic. I mean, the only thing I'd make a distinction on is if there's, like, doctor assisted suicide, if somebody has a fatal illness already and they're in serious pain, I think that's in a separate category. But whether it's a high school student, you know, uh, personally, I think there's nothing more painful than losing a child. Um, but I will say Seth had just turned 50. So I think moving into middle age was part of his, pathology in terms of he started having some chronic pain, so he couldn't exercise and his sleep was deteriorating. So, I think, as I said, suicide is traumatic at any age. Obviously, a teenager is has a particular kind of pain, but they all do. And I think the reason is the person dies, but then the impact and the ripple effect. You said it affected the whole community. And Seth, he had been teaching at MIT for a decade to 2 decades, and so his students and the administrators and all his teammates on his ultimate frisbee team and his relatives, of course, but also he was involved in like the neighborhood association. So the ripple effect is massive. And so I really think the people left behind, no matter the age, are both sufferers and also survivors. And I will also say, I think it's sort of natural when you live through somebody you love suicide to say to yourself, what could I have done to stop this? Right? Like, could I have, you know, if I just said the right thing at the right moment, would that painful moment of theirs had passed? Or if I had just gotten them out of that bullying situation or cut off their social media or, whatever it was, like you think you could have done something. And, for me, that was part of why I continued to research and dig and talk to doctors and suicide researchers and people who knew Seth to figure out, like, did I miss a sign? Did I miss some document? Like, did he gamble away everything or was he having an affair? Like, I wanted one easy answer. And with suicide, it's often multifaceted, right? And so there generally isn't one easy answer. And that's what's so difficult for survivors because, again, you think, like, if I had only been at the right place at the right time, and most of the time that would not have stopped it.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense and everything. Along those same lines, I know a lot of times, whether it's our crime shows or a number of other things, there's this notion of, what it would be like if somebody knocked on the door with that kind of news and everything. And you actually dealt with that because apparently it was a state trooper that appeared at the door to report that Seth had killed himself and all along those lines and everything. So could you speak to whether you think our police, because I know that even here I've talked to some police officers that feel that they don't necessarily have the adequate training in order to deal with a lot of situations, whether it's telling a family member about suicide or dealing with domestic violence or a number of other things. Do you think that our police force, whether it's here in your area where you're at or whether it's here in North Carolina, are getting enough training in how to get this information to people and all along those lines?
Right. Well, I'm not really an expert on police training. I will say generally, I wish there was more training on every level in the schools, in police forces, even among doctors who don't deal with mental illness about what mental illness is. So I think that kind of training, we can all benefit from more education on that. In my situation, Seth went missing on a Tuesday morning, July 1st, 2014. It was a beautiful day. I had just taken my kids to day camp, and he had been more anxious and agitated in the days before his death, and he was going to take the day off, and I was going to come home, and we were going to hang out. And I said, I'm just taking my kids to camp. I'm taking the kids to camp. I'll be back. And he said, I'll just stay here reading the paper till you come home. And after I dropped the kids off, we biked to camp. It was very close in the neighborhood. I came home and his car was gone. So that began a whole morning of a frantic search for him. And by about 11:30 that morning, that's when the state trooper came. And I've actually tried to find that guy because I don't have any documents about who he was, but he was very respectful. He just was very to the point, came to my door. As soon as I saw him walking down, I sort of had this terrible feeling in my body. And luckily, a close cousin of mine had come over to be with me while I was making all these calls to his family and to work. And So I was with somebody when I got the news, which was extremely helpful. If I was alone, I think it would have been far more. I mean, if it could have been more devastating, I think it might have been. But the trooper was, he just delivered the news and he was very, just the facts man. But I do think, somebody asked me about what we can do for mental health in this country. And we so think about mental health as separate from physical health, which of course it isn't, right? Everything's connected. And I just wish there was, more money put into accessibility, that anybody who needed help could easily find a therapist or a support group or a counselor. Um, I've done stories about the wait list now to find a therapist, and it's insane. I mean, you can't just pick up the phone and make an appointment. So I think more education about the nature of mental illness and then more access to help would be beneficial, I think,
Yeah, that makes
to
yeah,
every facet of society.
that makes a lot of sense and everything. I meant well, a couple of things. One, I mentioned Dad being an artist, and I'm going to go with this question may actually surprise you, but then I'm definitely interested in your thoughts around this because I'm imagining you probably got some of the reason that Dad created this protest piece that he did, and all along those lines. Because Dad has done several art pieces. Some of them are social statements, like social justice statements and everything. And the one that is probably most known in this area is called "Thoughts and Prayers," and it is literally like a fire extinguisher, if I remember correctly. And within the image is the notion thoughts and prayers because what he was complaining about is that a lot of times when we go through tragedy, we're quick to give thoughts and prayers, but they're almost like a platitude. They don't really have an action behind them or anything along those lines. So I just wanted your thoughts around that because I do know that even when you had this tragedy, there were probably people that were trying to give you what they felt was sympathetic appeals and everything, and you probably needed something. Maybe it was like that friend, a shoulder to lean on, or something like that, and everything. But I was just wondering your thoughts around this notion that we are sometimes quick to give thoughts and prayers and not knocking thoughts and prayers. I don't think Dad was either in his art piece, but sometimes we are quick to do it without thinking about the actions that can go behind it.
Right. I mean, look, when something terrible happens, many times there are no words,
Right.
right? Somebody dies in whatever circumstances, and the survivors, you want to do something and say something or write something, and oftentimes there's just nothing to say. And so that goes back to my point of, yes, sending a card is nice and it shows that you're thinking about the person, and so that's something. But what really helped me was the people who showed up and said, okay, where do you want me to take your kid? Like, where do you need a ride? What food do you need? You know, is your computer's broken? Let me go take it and fix it. Or, you need a break. Let me take your kids for 2 hours. Whatever it was, like the people who really showed up. And it's not always the people you imagine. I had some very close friends who just, it was too much for them to come to me and deal with what I was dealing with. And so they just couldn't manage it. But then other people who weren't even very close friends, they were the ones who were like, I am here, whatever you need, anytime. You don't have to be nice to me, because at the beginning I was just kind of in a state of shock, right? And I didn't know how I was it's like you feel it, your whole body is kind of taken over by grief at the beginning, right? Um, and so you're not always your most gracious self. But the people who really want to help don't care, they're just like, what do you need? And I think that is the thoughts and prayers thing. I think about sort of school shootings and the sort of knee-jerk reaction of thoughts and prayers, whereas you need action. And I mean, my circumstance isn't quite as politicized, but I do think people have asked, like, what kind of condolence card should I send? What should I say? And I really think the proof is in the showing up and really be making yourself available in whatever way that is. And maybe that person doesn't want you there right now, and that's okay too. Um, but it's a very difficult, I don't condemn people who don't know what to say in that situation because it's really hard
Yeah,
to know.
definitely. It would definitely be hard and all along those lines. When you've done your research after your husband's death and all along those lines and everything, did you find that there was a certain commonalities that existed within those folks that decided to commit suicide? And if so, what were those commonalities? And also, did you find that there were certain, you mentioned guns, that there were certain items that were more uh, accessible for suicide? Because I mean, when I think about suicide, I'm just going to throw this out there and everything. And one of the movies that comes to mind, and a lot of times people will use it because we're getting ready to come up on Christmas season, because it definitely touches on suicide to some degree. Is It's a Wonderful Life? Because if I remember correctly, the person was actually contemplating it in that movie and all along those lines. And I think at the end, it wound up not doing it because of some kind of not ancestral, but heavenly assistance and all along those lines. But I'm just wondering, what are some of the things that you have noticed are commonalities, and also do you think that sometimes Hollywood kind of glamorizes some of these situations? Because, like I said, the first thing when I think of suicide, I think of that particular movie.
Right. Yes, Hollywood does tend to glamorize situations like that. And It's a Wonderful Life is a wonderful film, but it's not a documentary on suicidality in any way. I mean, in terms of commonality, one thing is what I said before. It's that tunnel vision of you're not thinking about the impact of your death on your loved ones. You're just thinking about like, how do I end the pain? And someone equated it to like a burning building, right? You're in a burning building and the only option you see is jumping out the window, right? It's like that kind of pain and that kind of decision. Another commonality, which is also very sad, is that oftentimes people who are suicidal think there's something broken about them, right? And so they think the world will be better off without them, which just shows their lack of perspective. And there are so many people, millions and millions of people around the world who have suffer from depression, right? But of course, only a very small fraction of those seriously depressed people die by suicide. And often the difference is when you believe the state you are in will never change, will never improve. If you can't imagine like tomorrow will be a better day, for lack of something more complex. Like that's obviously a simplistic thing, but if you think of mental health, as weather, like we all have moods and we know like the weather, it passes, like it's pouring rain outside today, but I know that it won't be like that forever. I mean, that's a very minor example, but with suicide, it's like you don't think the current reality will change, and that's a measure of lack of perspective. So those are commonalities. And I think that in terms of accessibility to guns and modes of suicide, I mean, I absolutely think like this country and the accessibility of guns is unconscionable. Um, Seth jumped off a bridge near our home, so there wasn't a gun involved. There have been efforts to put, netting up on bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge. There's been efforts about bridges in other cities. And yes, that definitely helps. And I think making access to guns much more difficult would certainly help this problem, but not for everybody.
You mentioned something else that I sometimes am startled by, but I also understand to some degree the reasoning for it, because I have friends that are ministers, friends that are in the religious community and all along those lines. I know that different people have different religious beliefs. Some are more Eastern, some are definitely more of the Christian belief, and I definitely have some friends that are Muslim and other faiths as well. But I sometimes wonder, do do we sometimes put too much pressure on people by telling them that my way or the highway kind of attitude as well? Because that's where I get frustrated sometimes with my religious leaders, and not trying to get on a soapbox or anything along those lines, but I sometimes wonder because even after a suicide, a lot of times, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, they will be painted as if you want to be guaranteed to go in the opposite direction versus heavenly gates and everything. That is the quickest way to do it and everything, and that's what some of our religious leaders paint that as. And if you want to, like, they have some other views about divorce and other things that might be similar, but to me, that's one of the like almost steadfast rules that a lot of religious leaders have is that if you want to actually not make it to heaven's gate, that is almost a guarantee and everything. And I'm just wondering your take on that as one who's had a parent, I mean, not a parent, but a family member that went through that. And I'm sure that you are hoping to see Seth. It sounds like I hear that love in your voice. So I'm sure you're hoping to see Seth when you make it to heaven. And I'm sure your kids would feel the same and everything along those lines. But just wanted your take on the
Right.
religious perspective.
I mean, I was not raised very religious. I grew up in New York City to teachers, academics. Not that that necessarily means, but I don't, I'm not part of an organized religion. I'm Jewish, but like culturally, but not in any organized way. I think if you see suicide as a sin, I believe that you're missing a lot of truth. Um, because as I said, believe it's part of a mental illness.
Right.
And, I don't hear religious leaders saying, you know, a fatal cancer is a sin. And I get that there is something unique to suicide where on the from the outside it looks like somebody made a choice. And there is some kind of volition involved. But personally, I don't believe that it's a sin. I believe he was in so much pain. And, you know, people ask, am I angry at him or was I angry at him? And honestly, I was angry about the situation that I found myself in as a single mother raising two kids. But I wasn't angry at him because I felt like the pain he must have been in to do this was enormous. And I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And I would try to engage in conversation with any religious leader who wants to discuss this with me. But I don't think it's a sin. And I think that, I've talked to people who have had a suicide in their family in the past, and their response was to take all the pictures of the person who died off the wall and never talk about it and just push it aside. And that has not always ended well. That leaves people, especially children, like confused and guilty and what happened and raising more questions than it answers. And I believe the opposite. I believe, my kids are now a freshman and a senior in college, and they're incredible young women. They have healthy relationships, they have passions, they're political, they fight for, what they believe in justice in their worlds. And I feel like part of the reason they are engaged in the world and healthy is because I allowed discussion about all of their feelings around their father's death. And it wasn't always easy to talk about all of the details when they were so little, but I always said, you can ask me anything, I will tell you. And so they know that, asking for help is a sign of strength. They know what suicide does to families, and they know that people go through a lot. Like, people have secrets and they have traumas that they have been through, and they are particularly empathetic, compassionate kids. And I would suggest to religious leaders that, like, to be driven by empathy and compassion is more helpful than condemning people, as having sinned. But who am I? This is just my personal opinion, and
That's what, that's what
everybody is entitled to their take.
Yep. That's what we like doing is sharing people sharing their personal opinions on this show as well as some of the other shows that I do here on the network and everything along those lines. But in that same space, I actually had an interesting conversation with one of my family members recently, and they were talking about how, and this wasn't a suicide, this was a natural death, but they were talking about how literally they didn't find out that the person was as sick as they were until they stumbled upon a letter that wasn't intended for them. So they actually stumbled upon a letter, and that's when they first learned that a person was terminal, for lack of a better term, and everything. So I was just wondering, you sometimes feel that we are not open enough about things that are going on in our life, whether that's our own physical health or our emotional health or our mental health. Because, like I said, it was a very close family member that revealed that they didn't find out, and this took place. Well, I'm 60 now, so it's probably about 60 years ago, and everything that this took place, that they found out that
Right.
a certain person was sick because they literally stumbled across a letter and everything.
Yes. No, I think we're very secretive about problems. And, for all of our sharing on social media, and we allegedly, there seemed to be so much like there's nothing private, right? When you look at social media, but obviously that's a curated picture of a person's life. And, with Seth, he had never been diagnosed with any kind of severe mental illness. And yet, this is what happened. And so, somebody who just read my book recently said to me, it was as if Seth had a PhD in hiding. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of us have the outside persona
Mm-hmm.
that's very, there's this sort of American way of like pick yourself up by the bootstraps and don't don't let them see you cry. And I honestly think for men it's even worse. I think there's a gender thing going on. I mean, we men are, supposedly more evolved now and are able to be more emotional, but I still see all of this cultural backlash against men emoting and talking about their feelings and asking for help. And I still think, we have these expectations for men and they have expectations for themselves that they will be the strong ones, right? And people will come to them with problems. They won't show their problems. And I think for Seth, he he was definitely like that. I mean, he did not ask for help. He was not a whiner in any way. And I think that took a toll because he had such high expectations of himself that were unrealistic. And, he didn't give himself a break. And then when things got bad, when his middle age, minor pain escalated, when he stopped sleeping, he had something called tinnitus, which is a ringing in the ear that was very mild and low level, but some days before his death it got worse. And so all of these things together, you know, by themselves they weren't an emergency, but taken together without any kind of practice or coping skills. Like he didn't have any kind of long-term relationship with a counselor or therapist or anything. He just didn't have the coping skills. So, yes, I think there are a lot of secrets that we keep, and we have a lot of external facing realities that don't match what's going on inside. And I think that's very unhealthy.
Yeah, very unhealthy. What advice would you give to people? Because I kind of alluded to it, that I've known some friends that have told me that they have contemplated definitely taking their own life. And like I said, I tried to have conversations with them and all along those lines and try to tell them why they are needed on this earth and why they shouldn't do that and everything along those lines. But I just wondering, what advice would you give to folks that are dealing with people that might be contemplating suicide or might be even thinking about that notion and everything? Because I'm sure in your research you probably heard various kinds of advice, but what advice would you give to folks?
I mean, if it's, if they're really thinking about taking their own lives, I would tell them to call 988, which is a suicide hotline. There's really helpful people who staff that and can help, and if it's just kind of like I'm thinking about this, I can't stop thinking about it, I'd still call 988, but I would get them connected with some kind of counselor, support group. Sometimes people respond to being in groups, if they're depressed or they have addiction issues or other kinds of issues, that to see that they're not alone. Often people experiencing depression or severe anxiety, it's like you feel like you're the only one, but of course, that is not true. So I would just say get connected with an individual therapist, a group, you know, some kind of support system to show you that A, you're not alone, B, whatever you're feeling in this moment can pass, and no emotional state is permanent.
Right.
And if you just, just get past this day, you're depressed one day, it's the weather's bad today, just let's get to tomorrow and let's reevaluate tomorrow, you know, and talk to me tomorrow and see how it is then.
Not, but if I can put it on the flip side of that, and I'm not saying that there's a lot of people that do this, but there are occasional people. And I'm just going to bring up a part of the suicide that like the suicide conversation that takes place. And I remember this, and I graduated, like I said, I'm old, 62, and all along those lines. So I graduated like some 20 years ago, back in the 1984. So actually, this year would be because I was a December graduate, the 20th anniversary, the 40th anniversary of my graduation. There goes my math being out of order and everything. But I remember when I was in school, there was a gentleman that was of Polish background and everything, and I was a young lady that he was dating and everything. And one of the things that took place, as I recall it, and I may be having some part of the memory incorrect, is that she basically did that kind of like I'm contemplated it, I'm thinking about it, and it was almost like an emotional blackmail type thing as well. Because I remember we were both there in our dorm rooms talking to him, telling him to go see the woman, make sure that she wasn't going to carry the act out and everything. And I want to say that when he finally went there and then came home or came back to the dorm, he told her she was asleep and all along those lines. So it was almost like it was a form of emotional blackmail and everything along those lines. So I just wondered, I know that in your husband's case, it was a very serious incident, but I just wondered, do you find that sometimes people do that flip side of using it as a tool, the threat of suicide?
I mean, in my experience, I have not personally been through what you describe. Couples have really unintelligible ways of dealing with each other that when you're on the outside, it doesn't make sense. So I can't really speak to like emotional manipulation. I mean, obviously, that sounds just like that, like extreme emotional manipulation. I don't really to get into that in this book. I mean, I'm talking about this. My husband did, it was not a cry for help. I mean, he jumped off a bridge. There was no like, gesture. It was, he was going to get that job. He was going to do that. He made a decision at some point and he wanted to end the pain. And so that's what I'm talking about. Do people say extreme, seemingly crazy things to each other to try to manipulate a situation? Yes. Um, but I can't really speak to anything about what that might mean or how often it happens. I can just speak to sort of when it's a
No,
real thing.
that makes a lot of sense. I was just curious. Like I said, that was the
Yeah.
other time in my life that I had been in that situation. Like I said, that was years ago, and I actually lost touch with all of the individuals, including the one that was going through that. Because I want to say that their dad was a pilot, and from like the
Mm.
far west, like Seattle or something like
I
that.
mean,
And
I will say, sorry to interrupt, but I will say if a person is threatening suicide and they're just doing it for some kind of emotional manipulation, I mean, I would suggest that that person probably needs help too.
right, I would definitely agree with that and everything. How important? Because you kind of alluded to it earlier when you were talking about Seth's interest in ultimate. I guess that was ultimate frisbee, and all along those lines, or maybe it was ultimate football and everything. But I was just wondering, how important do you think it is for us to be connected? Because one of the things I talk about on this show, as well as a lot of my shows, is that I think that we need to have all of our aspects of life together, or at least as together as we can. Because I'm very big on emotional health, big on definitely mental health, and definitely physical health, even though I got to do better in that category myself and everything along those lines, and definitely all the other aspects. I think in my mind there are like, I would even argue spiritual health, because like I said, like you, I'm not deeply religious, but I do consider myself to be spiritual and even in tune with the ancestors and those that have passed on, and I still feel that they are guiding my life, whether that be my grandmother or that be an old friend like Baba Chuck Davis, who was a great dancer here in this area and everything. But I just wonder how important do you think it is for people to be in aligned with each other, even in dealing with being out of that suicidal ideation and
Yeah.
everything.
I mean, I think I completely agree with what you say that we are emotional bodies, we are spiritual bodies, we are mental bodies, but we are also physical bodies. And the other thing I would say that I should add, for advice for people, like grief stays with you in your body. Like you feel heartsick, right? Or your gut feels clenched. Like, and it's a very physical thing. And one thing that really helped me over years is to just metabolize grief through physical activity, whether it was taking a run, taking a walk, like in summer, finding a place to swim, or running around with my kids, whatever it is, that having physical activity, a regular physical practice is huge for mental health. And I think, for Seth, that was the only exercise he really did. And so when he had this sciatica, which was mild, but it prevented him from playing. I mean, that sort of was one element of the problem. And so, with my kids, I'm like, when they're sort of low mood, I'm like, go outside, take a walk, go take a run, go play or whatever it is. And similarly with sleep, I think we're just beginning to understand the incredibly central importance that sleep has. Like Seth's sleep had deteriorated, so he was only sleeping a couple hours a night for like the 2 weeks before he died. I only learned that after he died because I went over his mental health records, his health records. But I think sleep is incredibly important for our mental health and well-being. And to think that your, your body and your mind have different ways of being healthy, that's ridiculous. They are all connected. And so I feel like we have to have all parts of us in alignment in terms of staying grounded and stable. And again, for me, now I don't run as far as I used to, but I run every day just for like 15, 20 minutes to get my brain going. It's not even for exercise anymore. It's really just to get my thoughts in order.
Yeah.
And I think that that is really critical.
I'm assuming that you could correct me if I'm wrong and everything, but were you because that's what my degree is from at Marquette and everything was in journalism. So were you a journalist while you were married to Seth, or did you become a journalist afterwards? And if you were a journalist when you were with Seth, how much did the journalism background help you in the research that you've been doing and even coming up with this book and everything along this lines? Because I'm thinking, if I read correctly, that you were a journalist even during the time that y'all were together and everything. So I'm just wondering how much did this journalistic ability help you in dealing with what you were
Right,
going through?
right. Yeah, I've been a journalist for over 20 years. I worked in small little papers, on the West Coast, and then I started writing. I worked for 10 years for the Wall Street Journal, and I met Seth in the middle of that time. And then I worked for 8 years at the public radio station in Boston. And now I write, and for most of those years, I was a health journalist, which of course, when he died, made my guilt even worse, right? Because not only am I a professional observer, like I should have seen the signs, but I write about health and medicine, and like, why didn't I see this coming? Um, and so the way that it helped is that when you're a reporter, you kind of see your life in terms of stories and events, right? There's that famous Joan Didion quote, like, we tell ourselves stories to survive. And I really feel like that, and so shortly after Seth died, I remember thinking, this is a terrible story, but it is a story, and so I started sort of taking notes. Um, but again, this drive to figure it out, because when you have a news story, right, the way you do it is you ask as many people as you can who are experts, right? And you get different sides of the story, you get different perspectives, and at a certain point you feel like you have an understanding, you write the story and it's done, right? You move on to the next story. So I thought I could do that with his death, right? Talk to enough people, to doctors, to suicide researchers. I talked to a man who actually jumped off the same bridge and survived, to try to get into Seth's head. But again, all of these interviews gave me insight, but they didn't solve the problem of what happened to Seth ultimately. And so that's when I sort of, that was the aha moment, that you can dig and report, and there will always be another layer. And at a certain point for my life, I had to kind of pivot and figure out, like, how do I go on and continue to find joy and pleasure and help my children find joy and pleasure again? And so the reporting gave me a place to throw my grief and to channel my grief and to do what I know how to do, which is find people who know more than me and ask them questions. But I kind of hit a wall with that at a certain point after several years. Again, like, I didn't find a single answer that would wrap it up in a tidy bow for me.
Yeah.
And so I did do this pivot, and it wasn't sudden, it was over time. And, that's when we didn't talk about this, but, 5 years after Seth died, I remarried
Mhm.
um, another professor, and he had a daughter. He has a daughter who's 6 months older than my oldest daughter. And at first, I was kind of like, this is not legal. Like, I can't see somebody else like that. I had marriage vows, right? Am I violating my vows? And you start thinking, widows, there's this conventional wisdom about what a widow looks like, right? She wears black all the time and a high collared neck, dress, and she's suffering, a long suffering woman. And, I didn't want to do that. But it was hard because everybody's sort of saying, like, you're still attached to this person. And, it's like, when do you have the right to feel good again? And so those are some of the questions in the book. But
No,
we
and
ultimately married.
go ahead. I'm sorry, but
Yeah, we
that's
ultimately we married, and we have this blended family. And nothing is perfect. Like, there are obviously bumps in the road and everything, but you know that is what I wanted the end of the book to be. Not that I got married, but that, sort of, as traumatic and painful as some events in our lives are, we are able to go on and find some good in what remains.
no, and really quickly, 'cause I know you got limited time that I can have you and everything along those lines, but I hope I can get a couple of quick answers in along those lines. 'Cause I know that the person that Elisa tells me that I think you had an hour, maybe an hour, and a little bit extra and everything to go. And I do respect people and their time and everything along those lines. But that's kind of what I mentioned. Even Kim, the co-founder of this network, because I know that I think she's now in that space where she's now maybe comfortably dating and everything. But like I said, the person she married was the love of her life and the only love of her life, from what the way she's told me, and everything. So, at what point did you feel that you were even comfortable being able to step into the dating world and all along those lines? Because since you brought that up and everything, because I'm sure it took you a while to deal with the trauma, to deal with the kind of notice of stereotype of widows and everything, and then to feel comfortable that you were able to get back into the dating world where you have now remarried and all along those lines.
Yeah, that was not easy. I mean, the first time, so friends of ours, um, sort of said, well, a friend of mine called and said, do you want to meet a guy? And I was just like, oh my goodness, I can't deal with this. And I haven't dated. I mean, I've been with this one man for 15 years. Like, I haven't dated. And what do you do? And are the rules different? And, I felt like a teenager, like going to the prom, like, what do I wear? And do I wear glasses or contact lenses? Or, it was very destabilizing to go on a date the first time after he died. And so we hit it off. We had chemistry, but we just sort of went very, very slowly. And, I really didn't want my children to ever feel like their father was ever being replaced.
Right.
And so we kind of kept things quiet for really a year or so. And then we introduced our kids. We took them all to see Pitch Perfect 2 together, because my kids are really into a cappella. So that was the first meeting, and they were very interested in his daughter, more interested in his daughter than in him. And then it just over years, and we, again, we didn't get married and move into his house till about, just about 5 years after Seth died. So, and now the kids, they call each other sisters, and they're all pretty close, and they love my new husband. I mean, they know he's not their father, and there's never any confusion about that. But he's a very supportive, grounded, loving presence in their lives. And honestly, I think they were happy when I remarried. Like, somebody else can take care of mom now, right? Like, she's not my problem anymore. I think that was my kids' take on the whole thing. But everybody's different. I mean, I get some people just don't want to deal with dating again. Some people do it more quickly. I mean, it's a very individual thing.
No, it's definitely
I
individual.
couldn't, yeah, I couldn't tell. Everybody's got to go with their gut on that and do what feels comfortable.
What advice would you give to people that are in blended families? I'm gonna actually give some context to this and everything along those lines because my brother, who I don't think I mentioned mom and dad, but my brother is definitely dealing with some health issues of his own. His significant other, and he's been married a couple of times and everything, but his significant other, and they've been engaged now for a while, has actually a replacement heart, so she had heart surgery and all along those lines, and she's got a daughter and a son. The daughter actually has some like what do you call it? Kidney, not kidney issues, but where you have to have dialysis and all along
Yeah.
and everything. So yeah, because there's kidney issues and everything in that space. And then like she herself, meaning my brother's fiance, was like you. She was a person whose husband died suddenly. In his case, it was a not a suicide, but it was actually literally on a basketball court. And then they met, ironically, through I believe it was eHarmony. It was one of those social media sites and everything. They've been together for a number of years, but they are quite a blended family. My two nephews, because I don't have any kids of my own, are 15 and 16, respectively. Well, I was born in 2008, so that would make him 16, and his brother is a year older, so he's 15. And then their two children, kind of like your new husband's daughter and everything are older. So I think the one just graduated college and is working in the teaching field. So she's probably like 21, and her brother just recently went to college. So I'm guessing he's like around 18 and everything. So if they ever get around to getting married,
Yeah, I would say, again, it's all very
it's
individual. Eh, Yeah, I would say every
dating
family has
space.
its own, yeah, every family has its own dynamics. And for us, I think what worked is, again, going very slowly and listening to each kid's needs. And,
What
they're
happened?
all developed. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, I think depending on the kids' ages, that makes a difference on how you respond, right? Like, are you dealing with 8-year-olds? Are you dealing with 17-year-olds? Obviously, you totally different response. Um, but also just be tender and attuned to the kids' needs is what I would say. I mean, my current husband is divorced, and so his daughter has a mother. So I don't try to be her mother. I just try to be supportive and there. And, whatever she needs from me, I'm there. But like, she has her mother. And so I don't get into that sort of stuff. I don't feel the need to do that. So I think it's just like being very gentle at first and trying to figure out everybody's needs. It's definitely a balancing act. And I mean, my parents split up when I was very young. I was 5, and my father, remarried. My mother never did. So I kind of knew how it was to be in a step parent situation, but every family is different. We actually, I feel like we were really lucky, that the girls just pretty much hit it off. So that was a blessing. Mark, I think you're on mute, so I kind of missed the whole last bit of what you were saying. Do you want to unmute yourself? Okay.
Moment. All right. So I don't
Okay.
know what you could hear of me and everything of that last question, but what I was
No.
saying is that there, as you noticed when we first came on, there was another banner. It was the radio. I mean, it was the "Where's the Love," which is a show about bullying, and their guest was on yesterday. Had been through a domestic violence situation and all along those lines, and they were basically because I'd asked them because I have another friend who wants to tell their story. They were a child bride. They were a bride at 14 and went through some abuse themselves and everything. And the young lady that was on their show yesterday was basically saying that it wasn't necessarily just their story to tell. It was almost like an obligation to tell the story because it could serve as a important lessons for others. And I'm paraphrasing what she was saying, but I just wondered how much of that was where you were going, even with your own book, where you felt that it was important to tell your story, not just to put it on paper, but also because it could help other people that were going through what you went through.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that's the goal, right? Like, I know what I went through, but to be able to put it out there and, as I said, like, be the beginning of a conversation about this. And I included a lot of details in this book because so many people said to me, I can't imagine what you've been through. And, I kind of wanted to put details in there to say, okay, don't imagine, read this, this is what it is. And I wanted to be as honest as I could. It's my story, so other people have their own take on their stories. And but I really think it's important to share these human stories, even though they're hard, um, because it makes us all human. It makes us feel more connected. It makes us realize we're not alone, and again, that there is help out there. It doesn't have to be this traumatic, isolating experience. And I think getting the word out about that feels important.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and I see that passion even in the way that you've been talking to me today, and just in general, even when I did research on you and everything along those lines. So I definitely think that it is a passion project for you, and all along those lines. And definitely, it seems to be something important that you feel more people need to know on a regular basis and everything. But I just wanted, as you interviewed all of these different folks, both the doctors and the suicide researchers, was there, and maybe it's something that you've already alluded to, but was there something that really shocked you that you were not expecting? I mean, you said you did it because of what happened to Seth, but is there something that shocked you in your own research, whether it was what the doctors told you, or the suicide researchers, or even the folks that had contemplated suicide, like you mentioned, the person that had jumped off that same bridge where Seth killed himself and everything? But was it something
Yeah.
that surprised you in these interviews that you were not expecting?
Yeah, I was surprised when I think the most surprising was when a leading researcher at Harvard told me that even today, we are no better than a coin toss at predicting who will die by suicide among the millions of depressed people in, you know, in society. And so we are just the science and the technology is not where we want it to be yet in terms of being able to predict. As you said, people sort of are suicidal. They have ideas, they have thoughts, when things are dark, but we still don't know who will end up actually taking their own life. And again, it's the people who feel like they're in a burning building and have no other choice to ending their pain. So, I'm hoping that the research will catch up to the reality, and that we will become better able at prediction. The other surprising thing is that most people, even though they feel like the woman you were talking to, that she lost the love of her life and how can she go on? I think the surprise for me is that people go on, and the human capacity to overcome trauma and loss is incredible, and that surprises me even now
Yeah,
that people go on.
yeah, that they go on and they continue going on despite what they've been through and all along those lines, because that can definitely be a shocking thing. But along those same lines, and that's where I was trying to think of what the next question I had for you was. Do you sometimes feel, I'm going to come back to the media because we have a show called The Media here on the network and everything, but some of the things that are in hindsight were probably suicide. I don't know that we ever addressed them as being fully suicide. I'm just going to give you two examples that I'm aware of and everything. Because, like I said, when I think of suicide in the Hollywood sense, most people will say that Robin Williams took his own life and everything along those lines, meaning the great comedian and everything. But will they always say necessarily? Because sometimes they will use a drug overdose as a situation, and sometimes it might be intentional. Because I don't know that we've ever totally said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley committed suicide. But I remember even when Elvis did his action with the drugs, that was when I was a youngster. Because I remember going with my grandmother, who was living at the time, so that would have been like I think the early '80s, or no, mid to late '70s. Now that I think about it and everything, but it would have been like the late '70s. But there was the notion of him taking the drugs, and it was probably he might have even been doing it intentionally, just like there is some speculation that Michael might have been doing it intentionally, and I think Prince might have even done some of those things that he did intentionally as well. But I don't know that we always give them credit for that being a suicide. Sometimes we just call it a drug overdose. So I just wanted your take on are some of the things that might actually be suicides not being credited as suicides, I guess is what
Right, right. Well, I think, with some of those situations, we can never know, right? Like, did was the addiction so overwhelming that there was some subconscious, like, I just want more and more, I just want to get out of my brain. I think we're splitting hairs on some of these issues, um, and we will never know, right? Unless we can get back into those people's brains. But clearly, addiction is an illness too, and whether these people that you mentioned had others in their lives who were, giving them too much or too many combinations that were deadly, like, it's just hard to know. But I think, you mentioned Robin Williams, who died shortly after Seth, by suicide. And again, it just brings me back to the point that, look at Robin Williams. He had this amazing life, right? And he was so gifted and funny and loved. And yet, he had this dark place. And so, whether it's, a drug overdose slash suicide or some other method, it speaks to this almost double life that people had, meaning their exterior, what people see, and then this internal reality that's very different from what happens externally.
and I guess the flip side of that is that to some degree there are things that happen in people's lives that keep them here on this earth. Like I said, I've got a dear friend. I've kind of alluded to him a couple of times and everything, but he's got some children, and I think that those children are part of the reason that he is here and still wants to be here on this earth and everything, because he don't think that he wants to take his existence away from them and all along those lines. But in his case, I sometimes wonder if people kind of drawing a split between them and kind of like keeping them away from their father and everything might not force the situation. I hope that I'm wrong, but I could see that happening and all along those lines. So I just wanted your take on that, where sometimes people are not necessarily thinking about how their actions could impact the decision of the person to go ahead and make that final decision and all along those lines. But I don't know, maybe I
Yeah,
miss.
I mean, it just brings me back to what I said earlier, which is, I don't think, and we've seen this with so many people who die by suicide, like Anthony Bourdain or, other people. It's not about how many people in their lives are they love, right? It's not like I have the love of my children. I have to protect my children. And so I won't submit to this mental illness, right? It just doesn't, I just keep coming back to cancer. Like
Right.
people love their children and they die from cancer. And it's not about like if they had only loved their children more, they wouldn't have died. That's how I think of it. And so I think children definitely keep you going
Mhm.
on many different levels. As a mother, I've certainly felt that. Um, but if you have the feeling in your brain that you're in a burning building, maybe you're not thinking of your children in that moment,
Right.
and that is understandable.
Yeah, that's
Um,
understandable.
yeah, but yeah,
Just on that, and we'll get ready to wrap up very shortly and everything. But how did you manage to tell? Because I'm thinking that they were incredibly young. Because you just mentioned they were college age now. So how were you able to let them know? I mean, I know how you found out, but how were you able to get the word to your kids? And how did they take it when you let them know that their dad had
right, I died.
died?
Um, Yeah, so, a lot of this is in the book, but basically I found out at about 11:30 in the morning and I had to pick them up from camp that day at 3. So I had a few hours to come up with something to say and I had no idea what I was going to tell them. And so, as a journalist, one thing is how to find somebody who is smarter than you, right? So I was like, I need a script. I don't know what to say to the kids. So a friend of mine found a very skilled psychiatrist who called me and I said, please help me figure out the words to tell my children. And we went through it and she said, do not lie to them, but don't give them like a million details. Um, Tell them that you are okay and you are not going anywhere. And the three of you, even though this is a very painful, hard situation, the three of you will go on and you will be okay. And that's what I told them. And it was like the worst, few moments of my life, really. My younger daughter was 8, and the first thing she said, she started to cry, and then she said, "I'm not even double digits yet," because that's how she thinks. That's like her brain. And there were a lot of tears and holding each other, and I just stayed with them. I just stayed with them, and again, we had this incredible community. And um my house, we by the time we got home, my house was filled with friends and family, my mother, my brother, and everybody rallied around the children. And I think kids absorb grief in different ways than grown-ups do, right? Like they only understand what they can understand. And so I think in some ways that's like a protective mechanism, that it doesn't hit them all at once. And so I think it took them years to really fully absorb the many meanings of their father's death. But at first, they just wanted to be normal kids, right? Like they just wanted to fit in and not be the weird kids whose dad died. And, I tried to make that reality for them. And over time, they were able to absorb it and talk about it and ask questions and be sad together and celebrate his memory together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't claim to be a doctor, never intended to be a doctor. Don't maybe I have some doctors in my family and everything, but I just wondered because I know some things in life, it's like some physical ailments, are hereditary and all along those lines. So, is there any sort of the suicide ideation that is out there that is in your research that you have found that is gone from generation to generation? I hope not, but I don't know the answer to that. So I just wonder your
Yeah,
what you have learned.
right. No, there are definitely some mental illnesses that have genetic underpinnings. And, there is some research to suggest that, a parent who dies by suicide, the children are at somewhat higher risk. But there's also studies that show, kids who have seen the devastation that suicide brings, like that reality weighs heavily on them too, right? And so Knock on wood, they don't come to that point, and I do everything in my power to tell them to, if they're in trouble, to ask for help and to talk to their friends and their teachers. They don't have to talk to me. They do talk to me, but, just to be connected and socially have a social network is so important to feeling like you're not trapped in your situation, right? Like there are people who out there who can help you. So, it's kind of a one day at a time situation
No, that makes a lot
in
of
this
sense, and
case.
I appreciate
Yeah,
you sharing your story. And I definitely hope folks will get the book. I can tell you that all of our guests on this network, we have a Amazon store, so we grab the books and put them on the store. So we'll be trying to market the book as well and everything. So we'll try to get some more
I
people
appreciate it.
get that book out there because it does seem like it's a very important book and more people need to know about it and get it out there because I'm a big fan of our authors and everything. There is a question that I ask everybody on this network, and I've closed out with those two questions that are outside of the realm of what we've been talking about in this deep conversation. But one of the things that I like to do, you mentioned empathy earlier and everything, is I like to put an air of positivity because we are a global network and everything. So if you got any message of positivity that you would like to share, I would love to have you close with that. And the other topic that we didn't get to, and it kind of plays into your authors, and maybe you'll answer that question first and everything, is how did you get past that imposter syndrome? Because that's something I ask a lot of my guests is how they get past that imposter syndrome. Because I know a lot of us are afraid to go after things. I know that in my own life, I've been afraid to go after careers, afraid to go after dates because I'm still single at 62 and all along those lines. And there have been a number of other times that I have faced that imposter syndrome, not always well and everything. So I just wondered maybe if you could answer
Yeah.
those questions, how you dealt with
Well,
the imposter syndrome, because I'm sure when you read that book, there are probably people in your own circle that were like, nobody wants to read this book, or people that were encouraging
right,
you to read
right, right.
it.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I definitely went through like, sort of everybody's had a trauma. Like, would anyone want to listen to this one? Um, but as I said, I do as a journalist and a storyteller, I believe in storytelling as a way to connect humans. And I have seen when I go out there, like people line up and they want to share their story. So that helps a lot. The other thing I realized, and I think others realize, when somebody close to you dies, it really shifts your entire perspective and your priorities in life. And so I care a lot less about what people think, and I care more about like how do I live in a productive, joyous, empathetic way today, and how do I help my kids and my friends and my family and my community do that, because life is short, and when something like this happens you realize just how short it can be. And so, you know you may not like this book, that's fine, but maybe we can have a conversation anyway.
Yep.
So that's the imposter syndrome, and the positivity is, you know as unlucky as we were in this situation, in many ways we were lucky that we survived. And that's what I focus on, and that's how I end the book. And again, there is good in what remains.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely appreciated our conversation here and all along those lines. I will share with you really quickly. I'm also a big believer in communications and all along those lines because I think it's very important and that's how we survive a lot. And that's why I enjoy doing this podcast. But even when my dad was going through his health situation, and everything, his lady love, who by the way is part of your New York Jewish community. Linda Bellis has been a speaker and definitely is a known education person who's like in the education space. Was one of the people involved with KIP and everything along those lines. And they've been even together longer than my parents were together because my parents are divorced and all along those lines. So he's been with his lady love, I want to say, for about 25, 30 years. And one of the things that she did, which I felt was a great thing, and I enjoyed it so much that I even passed it on to my mom, who enjoyed it as well, which is his first wife and everything, where she gave a daily digest as to how his uh, recovery was going, and it shared both the ups and the downs of the recovery, but definitely gave the victories. As a matter of fact, the last one I got was him pictures of him going into his house and hanging out with some of his neighbors and some of the people that were coming to visit him now and all along those lines. So I just wanted if you maybe guys, and then we'll go out with one of our commercials that speaks to the importance of communication in our lives and the importance of like even those digests and just the importance of the stories, whether they're through journalism or through like a simple digest that Linda Bellin did, or some of the other things that we do in our life.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you as well. It was a fun conversation, and all along those lines, I think we're going to go out. If it's okay with you, I might make folks a little jealous because I think one of these commercials is one about food and everything. I got to make sure that that's on this particular brand, since each brand has different PSAs and all along those lines. So we'll see if I can find the one that I am looking for, and we'll get ready to get on out of here. But definitely I had a fun time with the conversation, and I would love to have you come back on whenever you're available as well and everything. But any final thoughts that you want to share? And actually I think I'll go out instead with one of our mental health, since we've been talking about mental health PSAs, and I've got a couple of them that deal with addressing your stress, and one from the American Heart Association. But I think I'm gonna go out with the mental health PSA, which seems very appropriate to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, I just think talking about our stories is really can be therapeutic, and I encourage people to read the book or not read the book, but even if you don't, just share these hard stories. It does help.
It definitely helps. Rachel, you've been a fun guest, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate Lisa for putting us in touch and everything. And I'm very serious when I say that if anytime you want to come back on this show or any other shows and share your stories, I am always glad to do that. I'm definitely one that believes in fellow empaths, and as far as I'm concerned, you are a fellow empath, and all along those lines. So I appreciate you being on, and look forward to having further conversations with you at some point or another.
Thank you so much. You take good care.
You do say.
Bye-bye.
I just need to be left alone right now, man.
No, Cam. I think the problem is that you've been left alone way too much.
Life's hard. The world is complicated.
Remember, you are not alone.
Love you, girl. I love you too.
Mental health challenges are common, treatable, and often preventable.
It's time to talk about it.
It's time to defy the fear and stigma that has made so many suffer in silence.
Instead, dare to love yourself and others.
Dare to ask for help and support.
I love you guys.
Dare to listen and show up for the people around you.
Join the conversation.
We are sending you signals every day.
We are sending you signals every day.
We're sending you signals every day.
We're sending you signals every day.
I'll be feeling sad, but you're too busy to notice.
We are sending you signals every day.
I'll tell you that I'm feeling afraid,
but you'll just tell me everything's okay.
I'll get real angry about something, but you'll take it personally.
We are sending you signals every day. My grades will drop.
And you'll yell at me for not trying.
I stopped caring about how I look.
And you didn't even notice.
We are sending you signals every day.
I don't see my friends anymore.
And you think it's good that I'm always home.
We are sending you signals every day.
I'll tell you, I wish I could go to sleep and never wake up.
And you tell me to stop staying up so late.
We are sending you signals every day.
I need you to look.
I need you to listen.
And ask me if you can help.
This is gonna be great.
You're gonna like it here.
You're gonna love it here.
You're gonna work hard here. You're gonna meet new people.
And learn new things.
Great things.
And do stuff you never thought you'd do.
Let me lay it all out for you.
Auto shop.
Solar panels.
Computer lab.
Biomed lab.
Language lab. Dental lab.
Phlebotomy.
Oh, I hate needles.
Financial aid office.
Well, that's important.
Fire academy.
Seriously? Cafe. Bookstore.
Welding shop.
But that's not the best part.
The best part?
Amazing teachers.
Really opened my eyes.
I love getting started with a new group of students.
You need something? Just ask.
Really supportive staff. This guy's hilarious.
Super smart people in my classes.
I learn as much from them as they do from me. Boom, it just comes alive right here in the classroom.
So many groups to join. Debate club. The final draft.
Gamers are Durham, baby.
Practical Nursing Club.
Business Leadership Initiative. Phi Beta Lambda.
Environmental Science Club.
Amigos Unidos. Spectrum.
Women's Leadership Club.
Soccer Club.
كلابك استودنتية عالمية.
I found my home here.
This was the right choice for me. We want students to be their best.
You're gonna push yourself.
The people around you, they make you better. I didn't know I could do that, but I did it.
To see what they're able to accomplish? Wow.
I had no idea what I was gonna do. The people here will help you figure it out.
It's so welcoming. Open arms.
They all said
There was just one thing.
I had to do.
Do great things.
hacer grandes cosas.
Do great things. Let's do this.